Welcome back to Two Beans in a Pod. I'm always fascinated by the ideas you bring to these deep dives, and today's topic is no exception.
Oh, is that right? What's got you so intrigued this time?
Well, it's this whole concept of becoming more productive by, get this, slowing down. It almost feels counterintuitive, right? Like we're so conditioned to think that constant busyness equals productivity.
I see what you mean. It definitely goes against the grain of our always-on culture. But, there's a growing body of thought that challenges that very assumption.
Exactly, and that's what we're going to unpack today. We'll explore how shifting to a less frantic, more intentional approach to work might not just be more sustainable, but could actually lead to significantly better, more meaningful results. You shared some amazing material that really digs into this.
Yeah, I think you'll find it quite interesting. We've got some compelling examples of individuals who have achieved remarkable things by consciously rejecting that cult of busyness. And we'll also look at how this idea of slowness is actually taking root in various areas of life, well beyond just the workplace.
That's what I'm excited to dig into. So where should we start? What really caught your eye in all this research?
Well, one of the most striking examples is the author John McPhee. He's written dozens of books, won a Pulitzer, and been a mentor to countless other writers. But his writing process might surprise you.
Oh, how so?
He's known for spending an incredible amount of time just thinking, like literally lying on his back looking at leaves, before he was starting to write his incredibly detailed articles for The New Yorker.
Wow, that's not the image that comes to mind when you think of prolific, award-winning writer.
Right, you'd imagine someone hunched over a desk, frantically typing away. But for McPhee, this seemingly unhurried, almost languid intentionality is actually a crucial part of his process. It allows him to really absorb the subject matter, to think deeply, and to synthesize those ideas before putting pen to paper, so to speak.
It really challenges that ingrained belief that constant motion equals productivity. And it makes you wonder, what if that dedicated thinking time is actually essential for truly effective work, especially in fields like writing and creative problem solving?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? And then there's the completely different world of network television. We have the case of CBS back in the mid-1990s. The network was struggling, and the initial instinct was, classic corporate playbook. Demand longer hours, push everyone harder.
Ah, the more hours in the office equals more output fallacy. We've all seen that one play out.
Exactly. But what's fascinating is that this push for longer hours, a prime example of what we'll call pseudo-productivity, didn't actually turn things around for CBS. The real turning point came from a far less likely source. Anthony Zucker, who at the time was working as a casino tram operator in Las Vegas.
Now that's an unexpected twist.
It is, right? Zucker had this persistent vision for a crime show, what would eventually become the massive hit CSI. But his journey wasn't about frantic activity or endless meetings. It was years of nurturing this idea, going through multiple rewrites, facing rejections, and just sticking with it.
So while the network executives were focused on this very visible display of busyness demanding longer hours from everyone, Zucker was quietly but persistently working on this project that would ultimately change the network's entire trajectory.
Exactly. And this contrast between Les Moonves, who was the head of CBS at the time, demanding longer hours, that classic pseudo-productivity, and Zucker's years-long commitment to his vision for CSI really highlights a crucial point. True productivity isn't always about the visible hustle. Sometimes it's about that deep, sustained dedication over time, regardless of how busy you might appear on any given day.
Which brings us to this broader trend that's been gaining traction in various aspects of life, the slowness revolution.
Right, it really started with food, the slow food movement in Italy. It was a reaction against the speed and standardization of fast food. A return to local ingredients, a focus on communal meals, the preservation of culinary traditions. It's a much more mindful approach to eating and to life in general.
And what's really fascinating is how this slow philosophy has expanded beyond just food. We're seeing slow cities where the focus is on creating more human-centered, livable urban environments. There's slow medicine, which prioritizes a more holistic and patient-centered approach to healthcare.
We even have slow schooling, slow media, slow cinema, this growing recognition that a slower, more deliberate approach can actually lead to better outcomes and a richer, more meaningful experience in all these different areas.
So the big question for our deep dive today is, how do these slowness principles apply to the world of knowledge work, the world that many of our listeners inhabit every day?
That's the core of it, right? Because on the one hand, we have this growing awareness of the potential benefits of slowing down, of being more mindful and deliberate. But on the other hand, we're so deeply embedded in a culture of busyness, of constant connectivity, of feeling like we always need to be doing more faster.
And that's where this concept of pseudo-productivity comes into play, that feeling of being constantly overwhelmed, of always responding and reacting, but not necessarily making significant progress on the things that truly matter.
Exactly. And the material you shared highlights how technology, while incredibly powerful, can sometimes contribute to this cycle of pseudo-productivity. There's that statistic about knowledge workers checking their inbox every 6 minutes on average. That constant connectivity can create the illusion of being incredibly productive, but it often comes at the expense of deep, focused work.
Right, it's like we've become masters of signaling busyness rather than actually achieving meaningful results. So what can we do about this? How do we break free from this cycle of pseudo-productivity and embrace a more sustainable, effective way of working?
Well, that's what we're going to explore in the second part of our deep dive. We're going to delve into 3 core principles of what's being called slow productivity actionable ideas that you can start incorporating into your own workflow to shift to a more intentional and ultimately more fulfilling way of working.
Okay, let's dig in. What's the first principle?
It's surprisingly simple. Do fewer things.
Do fewer things, but isn't it like the opposite of what we're always told? Like hustle harder, multitask, maximize your output.
It seems that way, doesn't it? But remember John McPhee spending months just thinking before writing. There's a powerful lesson there. By intentionally narrowing our focus, by choosing to work on fewer things, but dedicating our full attention and energy to them, we can often achieve far more meaningful results than by trying to juggle a dozen different projects at once.
Okay, so it's about quality over quantity, but how do we actually implement this in our daily lives, especially when there are so many demands on our time and attention?
That's where the practical strategies come in. The first is to limit the big, and the example they use is fascinating. Have you ever heard of Fermat's last theorem?
Vaguely. It's something to do with math, right?
Right, it was this seemingly simple mathematical problem that stumped mathematicians for centuries. And then comes Andrew Wiles. He became obsessed with this theorem as a young boy, and he dedicated decades of his life to solving it.
Decades. Wow, that's some serious dedication.
It is. And what's remarkable is that his journey wasn't about juggling multiple projects or publishing papers in different areas. It was this unwavering, singular focus on this one incredibly challenging problem. And ultimately, that deep, sustained attention led to a groundbreaking solution.
So the takeaway here is that sometimes, by focusing intensely on one really important thing, even over a very long period, we can achieve something truly remarkable.
Exactly. Now, obviously, not everyone is going to spend decades on a single problem like Andrew Wiles. But the principle still applies. The idea is to consciously limit the number of major missions you're actively pursuing at any given time.
By missions, you mean like big goals, areas of responsibility, those things that consistently demand your attention.
Exactly. And it's surprisingly easy to let these missions multiply without realizing it. You take on a new project here, agree to hit up a committee there, and suddenly you're juggling a dozen different priorities, each pulling you in a different direction.
I can definitely relate to that. It's like my to-do list is constantly growing, but I never seem to make significant progress on any one thing.
That's the trap, right? And one of the sources suggests aiming for no more than 4 main missions at any given time.
4? That still feels like a lot.
It might seem that way, but think about it. If you're truly dedicating your time and energy to 4 significant areas of responsibility, that's already a substantial amount of cognitive load. Trying to do more than that often leads to that feeling of being constantly overwhelmed and stretched thin.
Makes sense. But how do you actually go about limiting those missions? Saying no to new opportunities can be really hard, especially when they sound exciting or you don't want to let people down.
It is tough. One strategy they suggest is to create and fiercely protect a pre-scheduled calendar. Block out specific times for your existing missions and be realistic about how much time you actually have available.
So when a new request comes in, if your calendar is already full, you have a clear and objective reason to decline it.
Exactly. It takes the emotion out of it. It's not about you personally rejecting the request. It's about your existing commitments and your limited capacity.
That's a great tip. And what about those smaller, everyday tasks that can really pile up and drain our energy?
That's where containing the small comes in. And for this, we can look to the example of Benjamin Franklin, believe it or not.
Ben Franklin, the guy who seemed to do a million things at once.
Yes. But as he became more successful, he realized he couldn't do it all himself. He started delegating more and more of the day-to-day management of his printing business to his partner, David Hall.
So even Ben Franklin, the epitome of industriousness, realized the value of offloading some of those smaller tasks to free up his time and energy for bigger, more impactful things.
Exactly. And that's a crucial lesson for us today. We often get bogged down in this constant stream of emails, meetings, and administrative minutia that can really drain our focus and prevent us from doing our best work.
Right. It's like death by a thousand paper cuts. So, what are some practical strategies for containing the small?
Well, one is autopilot scheduling. Create regular recurring time blocks in your calendar specifically for those smaller administrative tasks. And a really helpful tip is to link those blocks to specific locations and rituals.
Like if you always process invoices at your desk on Monday mornings, or if you respond to routine emails at a specific coffee shop on Tuesday afternoons, that consistency can help you get into a groove and make those tasks feel less daunting.
Exactly. And another strategy is to require more of others, which sounds a bit harsh, but it's really about setting clear expectations and designing systems that distribute the workload more effectively.
So instead of being the default person who handles every little request, you create processes and workflows that empower others to take ownership of certain tasks.
Precisely. And when you're in a position to choose new projects, try to avoid those that are likely to generate a lot of ongoing administrative overhead.
Like maybe that big client conference, while prestigious, might actually create more small tasks and distractions than a focused internal project.
Exactly. And finally, don't be afraid to invest in systems and tools that can streamline those smaller tasks. This could be software subscriptions that automate certain workflows, or even hiring professional service providers like virtual assistants or specialized consultants.
So we've covered limiting the big and containing the small. Now, what about those unexpected life events that can throw everything off balance, like having a child or dealing with a family illness?
That's a really important point. Bridget Schulte, in her book about the time pressures faced by working parents, highlights how the demands of pseudo-productivity can be especially challenging for those navigating significant life disruptions.
It's like the system is designed for people who have a perfectly predictable and controlled life, which, let's face it, is almost no one.
Right. And one potential solution they highlight is the idea of creating workflows that pull rather than push.
Pull rather than push. What does that mean?
It's a concept they borrowed from manufacturing and applied to knowledge work. Think about a traditional assembly line where work is constantly being pushed through the system, regardless of whether the next stage is ready for it. That can lead to bottlenecks and delays and a lot of wasted effort.
Okay, I'm starting to see the analogy.
In a pull system, new work is only initiated when there's a clear demand and the capacity to handle it effectively. It's a much more responsive and efficient approach.
So how do you apply that to knowledge work, where you don't always have direct control over how work is assigned?
One strategy is to create a holding tank for all incoming tasks and ideas. Then you maintain separate active lists for your different areas of responsibility, each with a limited number of projects that you're actively working on.
So you only pull new work from your holding tank into your active list when you genuinely have the capacity to handle it without getting overwhelmed.
Exactly. It's about creating a more controlled and sustainable flow of work.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Now let's move on to our second principle of slow productivity, which is
Working at a natural pace.
This one really resonates with me. I feel like we're constantly being pushed to go faster, to do more in less time.
I know, right? And it's really ingrained in our culture. But the source material points out that working at that constant, unrelenting pace might actually be counterproductive in the long run.
Because it's not sustainable.
Exactly. We're not machines. We have natural rhythms of energy and focus. And when we try to override those rhythms, we're likely to burn out, make mistakes, and ultimately produce lower quality work.
It reminds me of those historical examples of thinkers and scientists who often took a much more leisurely approach to their work, yet they still made groundbreaking discoveries. Like Galileo didn't exactly have a 9-to-5, right?
No, we didn't. And if you look even further back to hunter-gatherer societies, their work patterns were much more varied and aligned with their natural rhythms. There were periods of intense activity, followed by periods of rest and social interaction.
So the constant, intense pace of modern work is actually quite artificial and potentially harmful to our well-being and our creativity.
That's the argument. So how do we bring a more natural pace into our work lives? Well, one proposition is to embrace serendipitous exploration.
Serendipitous exploration. That sounds kind of like organized chaos.
Maybe a bit, but hear me out. Think about Lin-Manuel Miranda early in his career. He wasn't just focused on writing and the heights, he was also performing with his improv group, Freestyle Love Supreme, writing newspaper columns, exploring different creative outlets.
And those seemingly unrelated activities actually fed into his main work.
Exactly. That cross-pollination of ideas and experiences can be incredibly valuable. It's like planting seeds in different fields and seeing what grows.
So instead of trying to force creativity on a strict schedule, sometimes it's better to allow ourselves the space and freedom to explore and see where our interests lead us.
Precisely. And another proposition is to make a 5-year plan. This isn't about creating a rigid roadmap, but about shifting your perspective to a longer time scale.
So instead of getting caught up in the day-to-day grind, you're thinking about where you want to be in 5 years and allowing yourself to make slower, stickier progress towards those bigger goals.
Exactly. It takes the pressure off of achieving everything immediately and allows for a more sustainable pace.
And on a more practical day-to-day level, how can we simplify our work days and reduce that feeling of being constantly rushed?
Well, they suggest reducing the number of tasks you schedule each day by 25 to 50%.
Really? Cut my to-do list in half. That feels almost radical.
I know, it sounds counterintuitive, but we're notoriously bad at estimating how long things will actually take, especially cognitive tasks. By intentionally scheduling less, we create more space for those inevitable delays and unexpected challenges.
And when it comes to meetings and appointments, the suggestion is to limit them to no more than half your workday.
Right, and for every hour you spend in meetings, try to block off an equal amount of uninterrupted time for focused individual work.
The one for you, one for me strategy. I like that. It's a simple way to create that balance. Now, what about taking breaks? I feel like I'm always on, even outside of work hours.
I hear you. And the source material has great suggestions for incorporating more intentional breaks into your schedule. One is to embrace small seasonality.
Small seasonality, what's that?
It's about intentionally integrating shorter periods of lower work intensity or different types of work into your year. For example, Cal Newport schedules research weeks where he focuses solely on reading and exploring new ideas.
That sounds amazing. I'd love to have a dedicated week for just reading and thinking.
Right. It's about creating those natural ebbs and flows in your workload. And then there's the idea of scheduling slow seasons, longer periods of significantly reduced work.
Like an actual vacation.
Yes. Ian Fleming famously wrote many of his James Bond novels during his 2-month vacations in Jamaica.
Okay, that's a pretty compelling argument for taking a real break.
And even on a smaller scale, the simple act of seeing a matinee movie once a month, a weekday escape from your routine, can do wonders for your mental well-being and creativity.
I'm starting to see a theme here. Slowing down, taking breaks, creating space for reflection and serendipity, it's all interconnected.
Exactly. And finally, there's the idea of working poetically.
Working poetically, as in writing poems while I work.
Not necessarily, although that could be fun. It's more about consciously shaping the context and environment of your work. Think about Mary Oliver's long walks in the woods, which were a source of inspiration for her poetry. Or consider creating a dedicated workspace that's specifically designed to foster focus and creativity.
So it's about being intentional about the physical space, the rituals, and the overall atmosphere in which we work.
Exactly. Now let's move on to our final principle of slow productivity, obsessing over quality.
This one feels particularly relevant in a world where everything seems to be about speed and instant gratification.
It does, doesn't it? But the argument here is that prioritizing quality can actually lead to a more sustainable and less frantic approach to work.
Because when you're focused on creating something truly excellent, you're less likely to cut corners or rush the process.
Exactly. And a great example of this is Jewel, the singer-songwriter. Early in her career, she was offered a $1 million record deal.
Wow, that's life-changing money, especially for a struggling artist.
It was, but she turned it down.
She turned down $1 million. Why?
Because she felt that accepting it would compromise her artistic vision. She wanted to maintain creative control and ensure that her music was of the highest quality, even if it meant delaying financial success.
That's an incredible display of integrity and commitment to her craft.
It is, and Steve Jobs' return to Apple is another example. He didn't try to fix the company by churning out more products. He simplified the product line and focused intensely on quality.
And that laser focus on quality is what ultimately led to Apple's resurgence.
It was a key factor. Now, when it comes to improving the quality of our own work, one suggestion is to improve your taste.
Improve my taste. As in, like, my taste in music or food?
Not exactly. It's more about refining your sense of what constitutes excellent work in your field. Ira Glass, the host of This American Life, talks about the gap that often exists between our taste and our ability. We might know what good work looks like, but we're not yet able to consistently produce it ourselves.
And the key to closing that gap is to just keep creating, keep practicing, and allow our taste to guide us towards higher standards.
Exactly. And sometimes it can be helpful to look outside of our immediate field for inspiration. They suggest becoming a cinephile, studying and appreciating great films, even if you're not a filmmaker in yourself.
So, by learning about storytelling, pacing, and visual communication in a different medium, you can gain insights that can inform your own work.
Exactly. And speaking of tools, don't underestimate the psychological benefit of using high-quality equipment. even if the functional advantages are marginal.
Like using a professional microphone for recording a podcast, even if a cheaper one would technically work.
Right. It's about creating that mindset of taking your work seriously and striving for excellence.
Makes sense. Now, how do we find the balance between obsessing over quality and getting stuck in perfectionism?
That's a great question. The example they use is the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper album. They spent an unprecedented amount of time in the studio experimenting and pushing boundaries, but some critics at the time felt it was too meticulous, even overproduced.
So how do we avoid falling into that trap?
It's about finding that sweet spot, allowing yourself enough time and space to create something truly excellent, but also knowing when to let go and release your work into the world, even if it's not absolutely perfect.
It's about progress, not perfection.
Exactly. And sometimes the best way to push ourselves towards higher quality is to bet on ourselves, to create situations with real stakes that force us to elevate our game.
Like Bill Gates dropping out of Harvard to start Microsoft.
That's a pretty extreme example, but it illustrates the principle. It could also be something smaller, like dedicating your free time to a passion project, or even reducing your reliance on other income streams to focus on a promising new venture.
So creating that sense of urgency of having something meaningful to lose can actually drive us to produce better work.
It can be a powerful motivator. And finally, there's the idea of seeking significant commitments, involving others in your projects in a way that gives them a real stake in your success.
Like finding partners or investors who believe in your vision and are willing to support you.
Exactly. That shared commitment can create a powerful sense of accountability and drive you to deliver exceptional results.
Wow, we've covered a lot of ground today. This whole concept of slow productivity is really thought-provoking. I'm starting to see how shifting to a slower, more intentional approach could actually be the key to achieving more, both professionally and personally.
I'm glad to hear that. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'd love to hear what's resonating most with you, our listener. What ideas or strategies stand out to you? How might you incorporate these principles into your own work life?
If you're finding this conversation as fascinating as we are, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to Two Beans in a Pod for more explorations of ideas that can reshape how you think about your work and your life.
We've seen how embracing slowness can lead to remarkable achievements in various fields, from writing to music to business. It's about making conscious choices, prioritizing quality over quantity, and aligning our work with our natural rhythms.
It's about shifting our focus from the hustle to the craft, from the appearance of busyness to the substance of meaningful results.
And ultimately, it's about creating a more sustainable, fulfilling, and impactful way of working and living.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the world of slow productivity.
Thank you for listening to Two Beans in a Pod.